Good evening, everyone. My name is Thomas Forth. I'm an associate professor at the School of Nursing. I shouldn't be the one who opens this colloque because the main person is standing here, Evie Nazon. But she is the boss and she asked me to start. So she will speak in French. So I didn't prepare anything fancy, but I was thinking to perhaps introduce the idea of this colloque. So this colloque is a collaboration between 3 universities, not between the universities, but between scholars who know each other from other contexts and who have similar interests without necessarily sharing exactly the same perspectives. And so it's Evie from UCO, it's Jean-Bernard, who's sitting, perhaps you want to stand up. Also UCO, Isabelle, UCO, et Jonathan, St. Paul University. And we are all coming from different backgrounds. So it's kind of an interdisciplinary idea. And Evie is the one who got the money. So in reality, it's she's the most important person. So the idea was that we are all interested in critical approaches to understand the world in which we live in. And we were interested in how we can use different theoretical approaches to understand what is going on in this shitty world in which we live in. And we came up with, so everyone contributed an idea to whom he or she wanted to invite. And then we wanted, because it's here in Canada, and you can see that the other scholars that will give the keynotes are more from the traditional critical theory. And then we came up with Glen Coulthard, who, as you all know, wrote a book, Red Skin, White Mask. And in this book, he, under others, criticizes one very important concept of critical theory, which is the concept of recognition. And a lot of work of critical theorists is around this. Then we asked him, because we wanted explicitly an Indigenous voice here in the Canadian context and in the situation in which we live in Canada and what is going on with Indigenous movements here. And then we asked him and he said, oh, too bad I moved on. I'm no longer so much interested in recognition, but I'm working on Maoist and third world movement and how they are connected to Indigenous struggles here in Canada. And we said, oh, that's great, because we want you. And then he agreed to come. So we are really, really happy that he's here. We are very happy that this worked out. We are very happy that it was possible to do it over the 3 different campuses. And I think it's a really interesting, diverse, yeah, I hate this word, diverse program. And we hope that you all enjoy it. Thank you.
Alors, donc, merci Thomas. Je ne vais pas nécessairement reprendre tout ce que Thomas a dit tantôt parce que ce serait de la répétition. Donc, moi, je suis Evie Nazon. Je suis professeure à l'Université du Québec en Outaouais, comme Thomas l'a dit. Donc, un petit historique aussi de comment l'idée a germé. Moi, Isabelle et Jacques Bernard, on était en train de discuter. On a découvert Rosa, on a découvert plein d'autres auteurs, justement. Et c'est ce qui a amené l'idée de ce colloque aujourd'hui auquel vous assistez. Alors, nous vous souhaitons la bienvenue. Et je vais demander à Jean-Daniel Jacob, qui est le directeur de l'école des sciences infirmières ici à l'Université d'Ottawa, de venir vous dire quelques mots de bienvenue. Merci, Jean-Daniel.
Alors, bonjour tout le monde, je vais garder ça court. J'ai été une petite addition de dernière minute. Hi, everyone. So as the director of the School of Nursing, I'd like to welcome you at the university that is situated on unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. J'aimerais également vous souhaiter un excellent congrès dont la thématique m'interpelle tout particulièrement. Repenser un monde en crise. Un congrès qui tente de faire émerger de nouvelles perspectives critiques par rapport aux rationalités néolibérales actuelles. Ces réflexions sont primordiales si nous voulons assurer une critique de l'économie de marché et contrer les tendances actuelles qui accentuent les inégalités, valorisant l'efficacité et l'individualisme au détriment des investissements sociaux pour le bien des collectivités. Dans le domaine des soins infirmiers, les logiques néolibérales sont omniprésentes et polymorphes, réduisant le soin à des séries de pratiques et processus dépouillés de leur complexité et des impératifs économiques. I wish you a great conference and hopefully engage in fruitful reflections that will affect our everyday practices and interactions. Alors, merci à tous, bon congrès.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Glen Coulthard. I'm professor of political science here at the University of Ottawa. I'm also Algonquin, and I have the very great privilege and pleasure this evening to, well, delivering greetings and welcome to all of you, but also to one of our esteemed guests who has flown over several Indigenous nations and their territories to arrive here. It'd be easy to say a lot of words that are flattering to Dr. Coulthard, but in thinking about it, as myself being a political theorist, a great deal of his own work has informed my own. There's a few people here that I'm sure in secret would fanboy, fangirl, and fanfolkum just because that sounds odd, but because of the book that he's written and his other writings as well, I'm excited about the work that's, well, I have no idea what it's going to be about. If he is pursuing some more Eastern philosophical traditions in his work. But I wanted to talk a little bit about what his own work has done, because I thought, well, if I'm going to be the Algonquin, and normally the Algonquin here, and just to situate myself a little bit more, I'm from a little tiny reserve that's about an hour and a half from here. And oddly, as part of sort of the educational appeal of having, you know, being here on my home territory, is that most people actually don't know that there's a little 6.9, and it's actually not even quite 6.9, 6.88 square kilometer reserve here. That's about 160 kilometers away from here, although I was just jogging my memory, and this all has a purpose about our sort of relationship with the land and the territory and the space, although we can say and acknowledge, as JD did, that this is the unceded territory of the Algonquin, is the more normative features of the ethos that we live in the milieu of how we orient ourselves towards it. And a great deal of that and my own understanding has been informed by Dr. Coulthard's work, especially, I guess it's a concept that has great purchase. You know, I've read it in European newspapers and what have you, referring to sort of like grounded normativity. And it's a lot less intuitive, given, and I think it's underscored by the work, and especially the title of The World in Crisis around alienation, is that we've lost the sort of intersubjectivity of the human with the non-human world, that this is unfolded over centuries of this neoliberal sort of pathos that, you know, wraps our world and shrouds us away, that we're very intersubject, where we produce ourselves as subjects that are very inwardly focused and forget about the relationship to it. But some of the local features which I hope resonate a little bit, is there was a report that came out from the Center on Pluralism, which is housed and it was commissioned by the Aga Khan last week. And it made news across the countries. Well, what has been sort of lost in the archaeological record is the exhuming, but more sort of mining an Algonquin burial site in the west end of the city to produce the sort of mortar, which became the bricks and the stones and what have you, of the very building of which the Center of Pluralism, or Global Pluralism, is housed in. That's been documented, and I'm thinking about the dispossession of people from their own land in such a way that they become the possession of others. And my printer wasn't working, so I have my notes in front of me on my phone. And so in affirming this, and affirming an affirmation, we don't actually have at the University of Ottawa a sort of an official land acknowledgement. They call it an Indigenous affirmation. And that always jogs my own view of it, is the critical aspects that Dr. Coulthard's work has pointed out in recognition, the politics of recognition, and perhaps I'm gathering he's kind of sick of hearing about this. Kind of like John Rawls probably has to hear about the theory of justice for his whole life, that he only wrote one book, but it's only because it's still gripping the analysis of theorists. All social theorists still just are now just making sense of it and what it means to ourselves. But the affirmation is something that's not really quite, as he points out, not a transformative politics. It's something that brings us as the Algonquin, whenever we make these, and it's not a slight on anyone at all, is that it brings in and affirms in the settler colonial institutions that they remain the site of political legitimacy. It's up to them, and especially say the University of Ottawa is, for those that know a little bit more of the archaeological record, is that this was the site of what we would probably consider an Algonquin city of about 6,000 Algonquin, but where I descend from after we were shuffled down the river, and others up north to Kittigon-Zibi. But in thinking about it, and I never give it out, and they also say, like, well, why should an Algonquin have to affirm for themselves, especially in front of everyone else? It's quite a performance for you that's to be consumed, but it glosses over, and I think this is the important point, that we see, like, our lost ancestors that are turned into the buildings of colonialism. Like the poignancy is not lost on me, but it glosses over the material deprivation and dispossession of the Algonquin here, that these land acknowledgements and affirmations, and I think I've also ripped this off, Dr. Coulthard, from a talk that he once gave, that I once saw if used, like, and it's true that it obscures theft and dispossession. It doesn't challenge the notions of place and land in the way that we probably need to regenerate in this time of crisis, as this colloquium and the talk is centered on. But it reproduces Indigenous peoples, and here being the Algonquin, as colonized subjects. So all I'm going to say is I'm here to greet you, to say that it's great to have you all. This has turned out like people trickled in, and this is almost a pretty packed room, and I could feel it. It's getting warm if anyone else can. And I've spoken for too long, but this is about to say welcome and greetings to everyone here. I'm especially delighted to introduce Professor Coulthard from the University of British Columbia. Has inspired a lot of my work, and I'm very, very interested to see the new directions that his mind will, treat us to. So thank you, Miigwech, and please, Professor Coulthard.
Well, that was suspenseful. So I would like to thank the organizers for this event. I'd like to thank Veldon for that wonderful kind of land acknowledgement. It's important to remain critical. So, but I would like to thank the organizers for this event. It's been a while since I've been given the chance to speak in person, like almost 3 years. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to share with you some of the recent stuff that I've been thinking about. If I'm a bit skittish, that's why. It's been a while since I've done this. My talk is from a book project tentatively titled Once We're Maoists. This is part of a new book project which started percolating after receiving 2 sets of comments regarding my use of Karl Marx and Frantz Fanon in Red Skin, White Masks. The first concern was regarding Marxism in general, and it came from the esteemed historian Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. In her reflection on my book for a symposium published in Historical Materialism in 2017, Dunbar-Ortiz argues that while the reinterpretation and use of Marxist categories by Red Power advocates has been undeniably limited in scope compared to other theoretical frameworks, they nonetheless do exist. She stressed that we just need to look beyond our usual historical and geographical points of reference to find them. Motivated in part by Dunbar-Ortiz's provocation, this new book project provides glimpses of an alternative history of Red Power radicalization and Indigenous Marxist cross-fertilization, one that reorients our gaze away from the dominance of US narratives and towards the struggles of Indigenous nations in Western Canada during the 1960s and 70s. With respect to Fanon, on the more benign end of the spectrum, questions simply asked me to contextualize my use, to not let the theory do all the work, but to get into how Fanon's work came to me as an appropriate diagnosis of the specific colonial formation and experience I was interested in writing about, since after all, Fanon's context was quite different. Whereas the second line of questioning concerning Fanon was more pointed. It was that I was perhaps appropriating Fanon for analysis that was at best beyond the scope of his concerns. It's black skin, white masks, not red, is how one audience member put it. This inevitably got me thinking about the relationship between theory and place, especially the indigenous land-based forms of critique of colonial capitalist accumulation that I set out to interrogate in Red Skin, White Masks. In Said's foundational 1994 essay, Traveling Theory Reconsidered, he revisits a claim he developed a decade earlier in The World, the Text, and the Critic concerning the ways that theoretical interventions, originally born of and informed by very specific historical, material, and ideological conditions, can lose their critical luster as they move from one place to another, from one time to another. Said's original observation was based on his interpretation of the European reception of Georges Lukács's 1923 masterpiece, History and Class Consciousness. The point I made about Lukács's work, reflects Said, was when it was picked up by Western European readers, many of these ideas core to his theory had shed their insurrectory force, had been tamed and domesticated somewhat, and in so there became considerably less dramatic in their application and gist. When or why, then, does Said eventually reconsider his original view of theory's malleability a decade later in Traveling Theory Reconsidered? Or to state somewhat differently, what prompts Said to now recognize the transformative, even radical potential of theory's capacity to develop and deepen away from its original formulation, but instead of becoming domesticated, restates and reaffirms its inherent tensions by moving from one site to another? To answer this question, Said turns our attention to Frantz Fanon's 1961 classic, The Wretched of the Earth, which he provocatively suggests was penned with the first French published edition of History and Class Consciousness in 1961 in mind. Said writes, how strongly the subject-object dialectic resonated outside of Europe, and for an audience made up of colonial subjects, is immediately apparent from the opening pages of The Wretched of the Earth. The Manichaeism Fanon describes as separating the clean, well-lit colonial city and the vile, disease-ridden darkness of the Kasbah recalls the alienation of Lukash's reified world. And Fanon's whole project is to first illuminate and then animate the separation of the colonizer and colonized in order that what is false, brutalizing, and historically determined about the relationship might become clear, stimulate action, and lead to the overthrow of colonization itself. So my presentation today will take up again what I see as Said's underlying inquiry into the relationship between theory and place. It asks, for instance, whether theory can be removed from its specific time and location and applied to diagnose, in our case, very different social or colonial relationships, and if so, at what costs and to whose benefit. Now, a lot of the research that I've done since my first book has sought to answer a similar set of questions. I examined, for instance, the often contradictory ways that Fanon has been deployed in the Canadian context to illustrate not only some of the tensions and limitations that can arise when theory travels too far from home, but also to quote Nigel Gibson, the radical or the transformative mutations that can occur when it transcends its site of production. Historically, the use of Fanon in Canada is quite contradictory. From the Quebec separatists, particularly those affiliated with the FLQ, to Pierre Trudeau's response to the secessionist demands of the separatists, to Charles Taylor's multicultural reconciliation of these two solitudes, to, of course, Indigenous uptakes of Fanon by Howard Adams in Prison of Grass or Tortured People, or Lee Merkel's Bobby Lee and I Am Woman. Today, I want to continue with a similar line of inquiry, but with a slightly different theoretical referent. That is, I want to focus on the political work undertaken by a small but dedicated cadre of Native militants going by the name Native Alliance for Red Power, or NARP, and its affiliate organization, the Native Study Group in Vancouver between 1967 and 1975. Through their example, I hope to show that this period of Red Power activism drew profound inspiration from the traveling theories of decolonization in the Third World, in particular Maoism, and like many radicalized communities of color during this period, molded and adapted the insights they gleaned from these struggles abroad into their own unique critiques of racial capitalism, patriarchy, and internal colonialism at home. Politically, I suggest that three interrelated yet core interventions associated with the global dissemination of Maoism attracted this group of young militants, either directly or indirectly. First, its displacement of the white urban proletariat as the world's primary revolutionary protagonist. Second, its so-called stress on the subjective importance of ideological and or cultural determinants of revolutionary change over reductionist understanding that prioritize the necessary material transformations framed within a rigidly deterministic understanding of world history. And three, the policy of Mao and the PRC towards national minorities. All three of these broad interventions, I argue, informed an Indigenous politics committed to achieving socialism and self-reliance through militant direct action, solidarity building, and land and community self-defense. So to begin this story, however, we must look at the history of Indigenous internationalism in British Columbia, particularly the intellectual and physical travels that informed the rise of Red Power in the decades that followed. Indigenous nations in BC have a rich, obvious history of domestic and international activism and diplomacy. While it is beyond the scope of this presentation to delve into the history and detail, it's important to note that one of the core determinants of this activism has been the refusal of the BC government to resolve the so-called Indian land question in the province. Without an acceptable mechanism in place to secure their rights and title, i.e. treaties, the default position of First Nations in the province and in Canada more generally has rightly been that the land remains ours and as a result still falls under our sovereign jurisdiction. Over the last century, BC First Nations have defended this stance legally and politically through numerous venues, including the sending of formal petitions or delegations to Victoria, Ottawa, and London to defend their case. For example, the Nisga'a of northwestern British Columbia formally began their legal claims during an 1887 meeting with the provincial premier and the subsequent formation of the first Nisga'a Land Committee 3 years later. Their efforts resulted in a 1913 petition to the Privy Council in England, which set out the demands of the Nisga'a that would prevail for over the next 100 years. At the same time, the Nisga'a Land Committee joined forces with two other early pan-Indigenous organizations in British Columbia, the Indian Rights Association and the Interior Tribes of British Columbia, to form a unified front in the Allied Tribes of British Columbia. 7 years prior, in 1906, Squamish Chief Joe Capilano, along with two other community delegates, took their political grievances directly to King Edward in London. Although the trip was unsuccessful, the British Crown insisting that the delegation's claims or concerns about land title were strictly a domestic affair, the trip demonstrates the persistence, I think, of First Nations political organizing over the last century, and also hints at the international context of such organizing. What is also clear from these examples is that the federal government would soon make sure that these types of claims against the state would not happen without punitive consequences. To this end, in 1927, the federal government made it illegal via amendments to its already racist and sexist Indian Act of 1876 to formally organize for political purposes or to solicit legal representation or raise money to do so, to pursue claims against the state, thus undermining to a significant degree the foundation of Indigenous organizing during this period. Well, the 1927 amendment to the Indian Act outlawing Indigenous legal and political activism had the expected consequence of curtailing this work. It didn't stamp it out completely. First Nations continued to press their concerns through the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, although often concealed under different guises. Through organizations like, for example, the Indian Brotherhood of British Columbia, which was an early First Nations fishing organization established in 1931, or the aforementioned Nisga'a Land Committee, which managed to carry on its work in a truncated manner, and a variety of BC Native homemakers clubs, which would eventually amalgamate in the formation of the British Columbia Homemaker Society and the BC Natives Women's Homemaker Society in 1968. In terms of these organizations, Indigenous women in particular were able to effectively use the patriarchal assumptions underwriting the Indian Act regarding the domestic and apolitical nature of women's labor in the home to discuss, formulate, and pursue their individual and collective political interests under the radar of an increasingly repressive settler state apparatus. The politics of Indigenous labor organizing in early 20th century BC is also worth noting here for similar reasons. As the work of labor historian Andy Parnaby has demonstrated, this history has a long lineage of Native radicalism, and particularly Native radical internationalism, especially on the shores of the Burrard Inlet in North Vancouver, where Squamish longshoremen not only dominated lumber-related work on the docks, but also were pioneers of industrial unionism there. Essentially, the seasonal wage offered by working the lumber on the waterfront served as a temporary buffer for the Squamish as two distinct and asymmetrical modes of production came into violent conflict with each other. Industrial capitalism on the one hand, and the subsistence economy of the Squamish on the other. Squamish men and women were important, if unequal, actors in this new industrial context, writes Parnaby. That all occupational pursuits undertaken by Aboriginal workers were seasonal is important, as it hints at the ways in which the temporal and spatial rhythms of a customary kin-ordered way of life articulated with the logic of a burgeoning capitalist labor market. At a time when it was becoming increasingly difficult to organize as Indigenous people, in other words, doing so as workers allowed Squamish men and women to selectively deploy their labor power through the seasonal wage to protect that which was most important to them. Access to a life on the land and the waters determined by customary law and tradition, and not those dictated solely by the demands of colonial capital. Protecting the fragile articulation of these modes of production by defending seasonal wage work became the focus of early Indigenous union activity on the coast. To my mind, the most fascinating union at the time to do so was Local 526 of the Industrial Workers of the World, established in 1906 by primarily Squamish log handlers. The local, formed a year after the Wobblies did itself in Chicago in 1905, became fondly known by its multiracial constituency with approximately 50 to 60 Indigenous members as the Bows and Arrows chapter. As far as defending the type and people of labor in question, the IWW was a natural choice, given its progressive racial politics for the time, as well as its reputation for serving workers who did not fit well into established union structures. While the local only lasted for 2 years, many of the Squamish workers involved in the Bows and Arrows went on to form the again largely Indigenous Local 3857 of the International Longshoremen's Association. The ILA 3857, as it turned out, would emerge as a launching pad for the next generation of Indigenous rights advocates in the province, of which the most prominent was arguably Squamish Chief Andy Paul. Paul emerged out of his union days as a tireless Native rights activist, fighting for the betterment of Indigenous people, land, and communities in BC and in the United States through organizations like the previously mentioned Allied Tribes of British Columbia, of which he was a founding member. And then after the latter's demise, the North American Indian Brotherhood, which he co-founded in 1944. During his tenure as president of the NIAB, Paul would serve as a friend and mentor to another emerging political force in British Columbia, Secwepemc leader and author George Manuel. Manuel would take over the presidency of the NAIB following the death of Paul in 1959 and serve in his capacity until 1963. After which Manuel moved on to serve in numerous other critically important provincial, national, and international political organizations, including as chief of the National Indian Brotherhood between 1971 and 1976, which is now, of course, the Assembly of First Nations, president of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs from 1979 to 1981, and as the founder and chair of the World Council of Indigenous Peoples from 1975 to 1981. Manuel's foundational 1974 book, The Fourth World, An Indian Reality, co-written with Michael Poslins, details this life of Indigenous internationalism quite well. Recently published just a couple of years ago for the first time since 1974, The Fourth World is unquestionably one of the texts, core texts in the wave of Native literature that merged out of the tumultuous politics of the 1960s and 70s. The text lays out the political and cultural foundation of Indigenous resistance to colonial domination over the last 4 centuries. He argues that colonization set in motion a Manichaean struggle between the colonizer and Indigenous peoples propelled by 2 fundamentally incommensurable, quote, ideas of land. Land as a commodity, as something that can be speculated, bought, sold, mortgaged, claimed by one state, surrendered or counterclaimed by another, and land as a relationship, the land as a Mother Earth. Indigenous people struggle to defend the latter against the violent globalization of the former is at the core of what Manuel calls the struggle of the Fourth World. Now, the Fourth World concept developed and deepened through Manuel's extensive, again, international travel and advocacy work, of which a 1971 trip to Tanzania was particularly important. Manuel traveled to Tanzania as part of a delegation of Canadian diplomats invited to attend the commemoration of Tanzania's 10th year of independence. Jean Chrétien, who was then Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development, was originally supposed to lead the small delegation, but got called back to Ottawa at the last minute. As a result, it was Manuel that was greeted by local politician as Canada's lead representative. This elite access that this very unorthodox situation provided Manu with an opportunity to engage in one-on-one conversations with key government ministers, including President Julius Nyerere himself, about their respective colonial experiences and what a genuinely post-colonial form of economic and cultural development might look like, one that refused to take its cues from mimicking European models. Indeed, Tanzania's 1969 Arusha Declaration outlined what was to be a culturally informed model of socialist political economic development called the JAMA, which was to draw off of the communal social relations of traditional African societies in building the post-colonial state and economy. While the first few years of Tanzanian independence were shaped by the economic and political policies inherent from British colonialism, from the Arusha Declaration until 1974, Tanzania had established itself as a veritable epicenter of freedom fighters, non-aligned movement militants, US Black nationalists, Marxist intellectuals, and Pan-Africanists, all enamored with the anti-colonial and socialist political stance offered by Nyerere and Tanzania's single political party, TANU. Socialism and self-reliance, democracy, unity, and peasant empowerment at home, and Pan-African and Third World solidarity abroad. And this is actually another story to tell here, which I tell in the book. It's about the global travel of self-reliance as a political concept that shaped decolonization efforts in BC and in the Northwest Territories during this period. Self-reliance was a kind of a concept that developed by Mao. And so the story that I'm telling is a direct influence between China and militants in Vancouver via Black nationalists like the Black Panthers. Self-reliance and socialism came to inform in the interior of British Columbia through a different traveling route, and it came through Tanzania and George Manuel's a trip there, and it came to inform visions of decolonization in my home territory in the Canadian or in Denendeh via George Manuel's influence or work with the Dene Nation, and then the Dene Nation's collaboration with militants in Tanzania. So it's all kind of, anyway, it's a nerdy story. I can answer it later. These international travels would eventually culminate in the historical 1975 founding of the World Council on Indigenous Peoples in Port Alberni, British Columbia, which hosted Indigenous participants from 19 different countries across 4 continents. The WCIP would go on to champion the rights of Indigenous peoples across the planet, with its advocacy work serving as instrumental to the eventual development of the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations in 1982, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007. So this is the backdrop which kind of informs the organization, both the legitimization of this type of activism in BC, but also its challenge by militants within the Red Power movement. So the Native Alliance for Red Power was established in Vancouver in the late fall of 1967, after a meeting was called by primarily Indigenous women in response to a controversial trial involving the rape and murder of the Native teenager Rosemary Roper by 3 wrongfully acquitted white men near Williams Lake, BC. 67 is really important because it predates the formation of Red Power proper by the dominantly U.S. historiography, which either situates Red Power with the occupation of Alcatraz and the formation of the American Indian movement. But this is at least a year in advance of that. According to NARP founding members Henry Jack and Geraldine Larkin, NARP members included, or hereafter Jerry Ambers, NARP members included a cross-section of the working Indigenous population, formerly incarcerated people, those that had abandoned high school, a few academics and university students, as well as Native working class folks who had either lived in the city or had recently migrated to the city from more rural populations. While active, NARP would grow to include chapters in most native urban centers across British Columbia, including Vancouver, Port Alberni had one, Ashcroft, Kamloops, Victoria, and Duncan. In its early days, members would meet virtually anywhere in small discussion groups that space could be found, including in members' apartments and bars, diners, Indian friendship centers, and in the offices of, importantly, leftist and communist organizations. NARP was informed explicitly as a direct action group to press the needs of grassroots Indigenous people living in cities. So one of its first gestures of solidarities was directed at the former Seattle of the newly formed Seattle chapter of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. Elder and artist Jerry Ambers and another NARP member, Tony Antoine, felt that it was important to reach out to this organization to inform them of their own group and to tell them that they would be willing to sell the Black Panther newsletter, the Black Panther, to help raise money to support the Black liberation struggle in the US. In response, their Seattle contact suggested that representatives of the two organizations get together to discuss a basis of unity. Subsequently, it was decided that Ambers and Antoine would drive down to Seattle for the sit-down, and upon arrival, were blindfolded by their hosts and driven around the city until they reached a secure location for their meetings, getting at the intense security apparatus of COINTELPRO at the time. There they met Seattle chapter founder Aaron Lloyd Dixon, who was appointed captain of the chapter in April of 1968 by national BPP co-founder Bobby Seale. According to Seattle was the first chapter outside of California and one of its largest and longest running. According to Ambers, they discussed the importance of their respective organization work, and this came through an interview that I did with her. Their mutual struggles for national liberation, the dangers of informants within their movements, and of the constant shifting terrain of their political struggle. Following the meeting, Ambers and Antoine returned to Vancouver, and along with other core NARP members, Ray Bob, who I interviewed, Lee Miracle, at the time Lee Bob, who I interviewed, Willie Dunn, David Hanus, Henu Jack, and Joan Carter, who's Lee's sister, Joan Stewart, established their own political platform, expressed in what they called an 8-point program, which was borrowed and adapted from the Panthers' 10-point program with the party's consent. The 10-point program was itself inspired by the global dissemination of Mao Zedong's Little Red Book, particularly its insistence on the revolutionary potential of the peasantry and the universality of any given political line being informed by and tested against the lived masses in struggle. This was incredibly important to burgeoning Black and brown radicals in the United States and Canada, for it broke with certain tendencies within Western Marxism that tethered the revolutionary potential of non-Western and or people of color to appropriately developed material condition in the progressive unfolding of history, with presumably white city dwellers in the lead. As a political formation committed to direct action, NARP carried out many activities. If Mao's displacement of the white urban proletariat as the world's revolutionary protagonist provided particular inspiration to Black nationalists like the Panthers, this insight, I suggest, was taken even more literally by NARP. Maoism was attractive to its Red Power advocates because it displaced not only the urban subject or the white urban subject, but also the geographical location of classical accounts of revolutionary struggle, from the cities to the countryside, or in our case, the land. For NARP, this reorientation was the core to Mao's attraction. A strategy which situated Indigenous communities to land defense is not only a revolutionary act, but also necessary for any effective resistance to the nature of capital accumulation in political economies like Canada, based significantly as they are on the extraction of natural resources. This analysis was made explicit by NARP in their evaluation of the oil crisis of the 1970s and the subsequent demand that it placed to increase colonial exploration and capitalist development in the Canadian North, the homeland of my own people, the Dene. dialectically linking the struggles of the third world to what they insightfully called the, quote, colonial character of the capitalist mode of production in the North, Narp writes, and I quote this at length. The ripening of contradictions and the growth of the struggle in the Middle East, the main source of oil for imperialism, brought out an energy crisis in the imperial nations. From that time, one could detect an alteration in their profit-making strategy. They redirected their investments in oil exploration from the Middle East to the imperialist nations. The rationale for this is that the growth of national liberation and social revolution in the third world was creating a, quote, unsafe political environment for investment. Thus, to main the sources of raw materials, it's necessary to find so-called safe areas of investment. The focus for this redirection is the Canadian North, and by and large, it has already been explored, and decisions have been made on the division of the North amongst the various imperialist interests. The only impediment holding up a wholesale corporate invasion is the fact that the North is, and has been for tens of thousands of years, the legitimate domain of Native people. It represents the only, or one of the only vestiges of genuine national territory for Native people, wherein they can realize the aspiration to which all peoples are rightfully entitled, nationhood. And of course, similar dynamics remain in place today, which is clearly demonstrated in the resistance of the Wet'suwet'en and Secwepemc land defenders against a marked increase in proposed pipeline structure or construction and liquefied natural gas development on their traditional territories. It is evident in the new push by green imperialists to wean itself off of Russian fossil fuels by intensifying the push to extract resources on indigenous lands here at home. And it's the ideological rationale that has further justified further extraction, in this case, the so-called ethical diamonds in the Canadian North, from which they were speaking of. Geopolitical conflicts created by imperialist ambitions coming home to roost on indigenous lands. Under such conditions, indigenous land-based resistance is increasingly being recognized as foundational to large-scale social transformation and has subsequently forced the state and capital to respond in kind through the production of what Shiri Pasternak has called new terrorist identities, risk economies, and security networks that will reconfigure colonization and capitalism for years to come. This is precisely what we are seeing with the continuous militarization of Wet'suwet'en and Secwepemc lands by the RCMP and industry paramilitary units. NARP people carried out or supported many of their land-based direct actions into the 1960s and 70s through its support for and participation in blockades and land reclamations, exemplified by the West Coast Nisqually fishing rights struggle south of the Canada-US border in the 1960s, which attracted celebrities like Jane Fonda, Marlon Brando, Dick Gregory, as well as militants from the Seattle Liberation Front and Seattle Panthers, the Fort Lawton military base occupation in 1970, and the Cache Creek armed blockade in the BC interior in 1974. Similar to the Panthers then, members of NARP worked to address the material needs of their communities they were a part of. They supported strikes led by students attending residential schools. They formed a Vancouver inner city patrol squad called the Beotuck Patrol that intervened into the rampant anti-Indigenous and settler violence provoked both by settlers and police. That's well documented in the downtown east side of Vancouver. They self-published a newsletter with a readership of over 5,000 people that covered topics ranging from the recruitment to land-based direct actions, general articles pertaining to the Indigenous freedom struggle, Native projects with anti-capitalist forms of economic development, news regarding the successes and failures of national liberation efforts in the third world, as well as suggested reading lists for its young radical readership. Yes, NARPsters also read. They held educationals, familiarizing themselves with the works of the third world theorists like Mao Zedong, Frantz Fanon, Kwame Nkrumah, Amilcar Cabral, and Albert Memmi. And in 1971, they formed a socialist study group to read, to discuss, and to plan. The NSG also had a sister organization in San Francisco formed by Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz and Robert Mendoza to apply Marxist analysis and national liberation theory to the history of colonization and decolonization in Native North America. And in 1975, they organized the Native Peoples Friendship Delegation, a delegation composed of 18 First Nations and Métis people who traveled to the People's Republic of China, paid for in part by the Chinese Communist Party, to learn about Maoism, the Cultural Revolution, and China's treatment, importantly, China's treatment or claimed treatment of national minorities. Upon returning to Canada, the NSG organized fundraising events to continue supporting their political activities, including setting up gatherings to share what they had learned on their trip. Typical of these events would show solidarity from local organizations also engaged in the struggle against imperialism abroad and internal colonialism at home. Such groups would include the National Liberation Support Movement, which was then a Vancouver-based Third World Marxist-Leninist Solidarity Group. The Black Action Group was a Vancouver Black Power organization. The East Indian Defense Committee, which was a militant South Asian Maoist organization formed in my kids' gymnasium in 1975. And the Progressive Workers Movement, which was an anti-revisionist group. In reflecting on her experiences from her trip to China, Lee Merico wrote, "We learned that we cannot be alienated from our own culture. We have to develop an understanding of it so we can feel closer to our own roots. In China, minority groups are encouraged to promote their indigenous culture, to learn and speak their languages. It's very important if our people are going to develop in an equal way, we must develop our culture as we develop our own economy." Now, there's admittedly a lot to unpack here. With over 50 years of hindsight, the argument that the Cultural Revolution in particular, or Chinese communism in general, was a diversify affirming movement for indigenous and national minorities is largely unsustainable. But what about at the time? There are a couple of reasons to consider here. First, significant resources were dumped into what was essentially a global public relations campaign by the Chinese Communist Party to represent as the sole revolutionary alternative to the Soviet Union for people of color the world over. This outreach included Mao's own statements of solidarity with the US Black liberation struggle, of which NARP was a keen follower. Second, between 1949 and 1976, Mao's foreign policy promoted China as a quasi-tourist destination for worldly revolutionaries. What Juliet Level has called a hospitality machine, designed to distract from unsavory realities by catering to the interests of worldly guests. The machinery ultimately served to amplify the virtues of the communists and Mao to would-be sympathizers abroad. In terms of the downplayed realities, perhaps the most glaring was China's representation, for instance, of the rebellion in Tibet. As Robeson Fraser has explained, this armed uprising was portrayed as a minor conflict started by the upper and landowning elites, a view that was deliberately disregarded the revolt's multi-class composition and the reality that it represented a popular Tibetan rejection of China's claims to Tibet. Based on this conversation I've had, or based on the conversations I've had with people like Ray Bob, who is one of the delegates to the trip, on the trip, I suspect that similarly scripted representations were provided to folks on the Native Peoples delegation in 1975. Such representation suggested that what was happening in Tibet was solely a reactionary movement against Chinese communism propped up by Western powers. But as with the influence of third world theories or third world inspired Marxisms in general, the pull of Maoism among Red Power organizers in Vancouver began to wane as we close out the 1970s. And there are a number of reasons for this. First, many people of color on the left and in the US and Canada were dismayed by directions in Chinese foreign policy, which hampered its ability to claim moral authority in leading the world revolution against colonialism and imperialism. The instrumentality of China's interventions in Africa, in particular, punctuate this decline in leadership, especially in the wake of its 1975 decision to support the US-backed white supremacist regime in South Africa and its colonial contest with Angola. China's betrayal was particularly felt strong amongst the Black left, which, as we have seen, was one of NARP's longest interlocutors. Second, in a manner similar to the US and its counterintelligence program, over time, the instruments and techniques of Canadian state repression created irreparable cracks in the movement through the use of informants, misinformation campaigns, and an increase in state violence. To a certain extent, this resulted in a culture of paranoia, increased sectarianism, resulting in an aversion to internal group dissent, organizational power structures, and ultimately a decline in membership. And third, and perhaps most importantly, some former members also became more deeply entrenched in their own communities' cultural and political traditions, and began to organize squarely within the normative frameworks offered by these practices. Even with this being the case, however, some members of NARP refused to see these disparate revolutionary traditions, those offered by third world Marxist orientations and indigenous political thought, as incommensurable. They were different, yes, but united in their commitment to justice and the collective project of freedom. Thank you. Masi.
So thank you very much. Okay. I didn't know that there are two micros. Okay, so I have the task to animate the discussion, which is very easy to do after this complex talk. So are there any questions or critiques or comments? So my question would be perhaps then,
Yeah.
Thank you. That's wonderful. I was wondering if you could bring it up to the present, talk about contemporary talk a little bit about contemporary organization with anti-imperialist movements among First Nations, particularly in the West.
Yeah, obviously. Well, this is a historical account, so it's kind of like I've joked in saying that it's a prequel to some of the stuff that I did in Red Skin, White Mass, and that's particularly kind of not displacing, but alongside the question of labor, we have to put the question of land. And it turns out that this was a thought that a lot of these organizations, when taken out of the historical blind spot of US historiography, were doing. Directly in this lineage would be like the Gittiman checkpoint and Wet'suwet'en and the tiny house warriors and so on, both in a genealogical sort of sense that they're often the grandchildren or the great-grandchildren of the people who were leading this front in an earlier period. But also, I think this is where the political economy of land defense comes into play. So in my conclusion, I'm trying to bring this up to speed by updating the reproduction of colonial capitalist relations through vitally important flows of capital coming on and off or leaving the reserve, and the importance of that tactic, which was often seen as not a prescription, but just as a response, which was the form of the blockade. And I'm saying that in terms of accumulation in general is a far more sophisticated and nuanced form of resistance, which which has until recently really not been examined all that well.
Okay, I try, but I'm not sure if I make any sense. So if I understand correctly, is what you just emphasized is that there was a broader connection, deeper link between Black anti-racist struggles and indigenous struggles. No, I can say this. Okay, so my question then, and it's perhaps a little bit related to the question. So if we look at today, then particularly your emphasis on the question of land is what divides anti-racist, Black anti-racist struggles to indigenous struggles, no? So that, and that's perhaps a little bit related to this. So I wouldn't say you appropriated Fanon or something like this, but still it's a lot of Afro-pessimists read Fanon in a certain way. You know, so what I want to say is that one could say that perhaps one reason why the Black anti-racist movements and the indigenous movement do not easily cooperate nowadays is perhaps exactly this question of land that divides the two movements in a way. That's correct?
That might be a reason for, like, in a contemporary context. And this was part of the response, like the reason why I thought that this history is so important. It's because it showed that some of the assumptions and kind of identitarian politics of indigenous peoples or Afro-pessimism or whatever was very ahistorical in its examination. So there's a time in not too recent history when there was a lot of cross-fertilization and lots of like material and ideological support for each other's struggles. And so what I do in this history is like speculate a little bit as to, and ask people like what's behind some of the foreclosing of such solidarities by contemporary, largely academics. Like this is still less of a problem, I've been told, from people engaged in actual struggle on the streets or on the land, was a concept, or is the concept of internal colonialism. So I get into this in a chapter. So internal colonialism, like settler colonialism, wasn't a thing it wasn't part of the lexicon of struggle during this point in time. Internal colonialism was, and there's a number of community or people of color or whatever that had access to the language of decolonization and self-determination because they were internal colonies of the colonial state like US and Canada. And this wasn't seen as a contradiction for people in NARP, for the Dene in the Northwest Territories, for the Secwepemc in the interior British Columbia, because I think that the language of settler colonialism has a liberalized assumption of the normative importance of both territoriality and property, so a commodified understanding of land. But also it brings in some normative importance to here firstness, which I don't think manifests itself in these movements or the theoreticians of these movements like it does now, especially that it's become the language of the day. So in like I'll just pick on my own people for an example, like boundary disputes, and everything in the north is struggles over a conception of land at the transition point of land being a relationship and land being a commodified thing that can be like George Manuel says in the fourth rule, something that commodified, sold, parceled up, blah 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 blah. And I think that concept of land was at the core of this type of organizing. It was at the core of the settler, or at the internal colonial thesis, and settler colonialism as a theoretical and academic or enterprise, with its particularly white settler colonialism, has gone in like it's imported this subject forming sort of attachment to land as both territory and property, but also this the normative importance of who's here first, which didn't seem to animate the politics of the time and activists that I'm thinking of.
We'll go here first. I think I saw your hand first.
Oh, okay. Hello. Wow, I have a microphone. Thank you so much. That was amazing, and I'm so grateful, and also really looking forward to this book. So, I was struck by the way in which you began this talk as a kind of a way of responding to your critics, and particularly responding to this critique of appropriation of Fanon and of kind of Marxist-derived approaches, which really strikes me as odd. And I would like to kind of come back to that and ask you some questions about this, because I understand that the rest of your talk was in many ways a kind of a masterful showing of how wrong, in fact, your critics are, showing how Marxist theories and practices of what we would call really existing socialism here in the Chinese variant actually traveled in concrete, transnational, potent and potently problematic ways. So could you bring us back to the beginning and talk a little bit more about for whom is for a lack of a better term, translatability of theory actually a problem? Under what conditions does this critique, what enables such a critique? What work does that critique do? Mm-hmm. And how do you want this project to respond to it in more, shall I say, explicit ways? Thank you.
Like Said's transition between the way that he wrote of the way that theory traveled in The World, the Text, and the Critic to Traveling Theory Reconsidered, I would like to hold out a way in which interventions are inappropriately deployed from one space to another, or one time to another. So like in the intro, I get into some of the absolutely bizarre way in which Fanon is taken up in Canada and in this fucking city. So you have like Pierre Bellier and the FLQ people claiming themselves the wretched of the earth, and then you have Pierre Elliott Trudeau in, I think it's a 1964 essay called forgot, what did I say it was? Something counter-revolution, or separatist counter-revolutionaries, where he's lambasting or critiquing the FL or the separatists for their childish reading of Fanon, of which they only read the first chapter of The Wretched of the Earth, and they don't bother taking in his critique of nationalism. So I think that those, and then as I do in the first book, the appropriation of this Fanonian language in essentially what Charles Taylor is doing and trying to reconcile these separatists and this this Trudeau type sort of federalism. And then like, I want to be able to say like, no, that's stripping it of its like ideological, but almost all meaning when you can defend a settler state using this anti-colonial sort of vernacular, or this theorist in particular. So I want to like be able to kind of critically hold that in as a legitimate response. The other thing, and I'm just kind of speaking now, is like Mao is really a tricky like Maoism is a tricky theorist or a theory in order to look at some of these, the way that it global, because at some points I want to say like, this is like a floating signifier. It doesn't really have a historical referent that's talking about it. And if you're engaged in like historians of Chinese communism, it like what Maoism of, or like the attraction of Mao that's happening in the bush outside of Yellowknife is quite different than, but it's like, it's similarly sometimes non-recognizable when it's in Peru, when it's in India, and so on. So a long story short, I haven't found the way in which to answer your question. I want to say that there's some uses and abuses of theory when it's allowed to travel away from its original place or time. But I also want to look at the, like I said, the kind of radical mutations that can happen when something is interpreted through place and location. And that's what I think is happening here. And then it takes on a life of its own, even though it's no longer, you can no longer attribute it to a certain theoretical tradition or history or what have you.
Miigwech, thank you so much for your talk. I have a question in regards to the learnings of resistance that came through when you interviewed the members of NARC. Given that they were Indigenous leaders of the time, and given that Indigenous peoples we've always resisted the impacts of settler colonialism in our community, and your work, I'm so excited to read your work precisely because we don't know enough about the resistance through it all. I'm curious to know if they talked about any type of ancestral understanding of resistance or any type of movement towards an Indigenous-led understanding of resistance through their work.
Yeah, well, this just allows me to speak about all the conversations that I've had with these amazing people. Jerry Ambers, or Larkin, when she was in NARP, speaks of like the understanding of her first like crash course in organizing was as a student at the Port Alberni Residential School. And they used to really be involved with their main concern, aside from like all the horrific violences that school entails, was the food sucked so bad. Like it was like just garbage that they were eating. And so she was talked to me about speaking about this colleague or a classmate of hers, which had organized student-led roaming strikes that eventually got the administration to serve more humane food. And she tapped into that history of resistance that came from a community, which was her first experience with quote unquote activism, as she said. It's also why each of these chapters is like to get out of the assumption that like these youthful militants were just kind of attracted to Mao because it was a fad or whatever. I get out of that narrative that we were just kind of willy-nilly sort of theoretically promiscuous, to use Audra Simpson's terms, this has a lineage and a history of this profoundly international type advocacy work. And then it gets out of the assumption that Indigenous work is like, if it's not traditional in that understand, then it's somehow corrupt or or it's inauthentic and stuff like that. And I'm saying, like, no, that portrayal of Indigenous peoples comes at a very specific institutional time. It coalesces around the recognition of Indigenous people or Aboriginal peoples in the Constitution, and no critically thinking person or individual in the bush or otherwise does not interpret the world from their location, but they're always constantly engaging with the thought and traditions of others. That's what it means to be human. So it deals with that by kind of placing this more contemporary history, whether it's the Dene Nation in the 1970s, NARP in the late 1960s, 70s, or what Manuel's doing in this book. It places that in a longer history of this work, which obviously informs this type of activism and the theoretical influences of it, people critically thinking people in the world. So it just kind of periodizes it appropriately.
Hi, thank you so much. This is, like everyone said so far, super interesting. I have two questions. One is, I've noticed that in non-Indigenous communities that are supporting land defenders, Indigenous land defenders, that they often come from an anarchist tradition. And so I was wondering what your thoughts are today on the anarchist reflections and influences on land defense in Indigenous land defense. And then the second question is, has a connection to land as relationship. And I'm trying to understand how in settler colonialism, those of us who disagree with it can be working on moving away from a land as commodity perspective towards a land as relationship perspective without ourselves dabbling in cultural appropriation and further colonial perspectives. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
The latter, I don't really. I'm so exhausted by that project. I don't think it's mine. I'm not very good at it. So the latter, I really haven't. I'm forced to think about, but I don't like talking about, really. The second, I would be happy to share my thoughts on anarchism. My thoughts on I am an Indigenous nationalist, I think, with strong feminist inclinations, very kind of unconventionally Marxist, in that I've also inherited a bunch of anarchist affiliations. So I think I answer it subtly. It's buried in the very beginning of Red Skin, White Masks in my analysis of Marx and the critique of Marx as primitive accumulation as something that's historically situated in the past, but as also inherent to states, like states, whether socialist or capitalist, inherently it's structured around the dispossession of previously autonomous and self-determining communities. And that critique was made in an early version in 1891, I believe, by Peter Kropotkin of Marx's first volume of Capital, particularly the writings on primitive accumulation. So I don't think that the state can be recuperated in any sort of a way because of the concept, or because of the notion of territoriality and control that it's premised on. And I think that there are Marxists or Marxist historians in particular who are starting to kind of let their, like Robin Kelly, for instance, is letting his more anarchistic sort of elements come through what was like a fairly at times orthodox communist history. So I think that, like, I'm very sympathetic to anarchist traditions of solidarity, and think that, like, the political economy of Marxism is a diagnostic, is right on, appropriately modified. But I'm all for the anarchists when it comes to the question of what is to be done.
Masicho, for your presentation. Maybe this is also a question maybe related to what you just said you don't like to talk about, or maybe it is. So if it is, please disregard. So given this is a symposium focused on critical theory, and given your study on how theory travels across space and context, how do you desire critical or Western critical theory pick up indigenous theory, whether that is academic theory or maybe tribal theory as it is passed on in indigenous nations?
Well, like in again, like in the first book, it thinks of a way in which, like, tradition critically understood is revitalized as both a subjective, like, in order to deal with the effects of colonialism on the individual and collective subjectivity of indigenous people, but in a way that is directed at the material structure of the world in order to change it or to revolutionize it or whatever. And those get at these two levels or fronts that the war happens, that reproduce colonialism over time, that Fanon was so astute at diagnosing. I think there are traditions within the West that also have a revolutionary potential, that ought to be revived by colonizer subjects, instead of the liberal capitalist bullshit that seems to rule the world. So there's, like, Foucault, like, and the resurrection or the resurgence, if you will, of subalternized knowledges, and to undergo that sort of desubjectification, but also in relationship to indigenous theoretical or practical accounts of it, seems to be a project that would be decolonizing on the settler subject end of the relationship, I guess. So it's about not appropriating, but rebuilding these subalternized traditions, in which that relationship can perhaps be allowed to flourish rather than be stamped down into sameness. So it's about, like, I think I'm thinking of it more that way than whether or not you can learn anything from indigenous peoples, or even bleeding into the appropriation question. I don't know if that makes sense.
Any other questions or comments?
I think we end the question session now, and I know that we have an announcement before you socialize, but perhaps the last chance, if there's any comment you want, he's still here. And now it's the chance. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. And if you want to make your announcement, then.
Thank you. You've been very kind.